I'm Professor Samir Chopra from the Philosophy Department. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here to this Frederick Ewen lecture in Civil Liberties and Academic Freedom. The Frederick Ewen lecture series is a lecture series staged and sponsored by the Wolf Institute in honor and memory of Professor Frederick Ewen of the English Department, who taught here at Brooklyn College and who lost his job due to persecution during the McCarthy era. In those days, academic freedom was not quite as well protected as we imagine it to be now. His nephew, Herbert Kurz, gave the Wolf Institute the funds for this lecture series, and also sponsored the Herbert Kurz Chair on Constitutional Rights, which sponsors a professorship in the Political Science Department, currently held by Professor Anna Law. The theme of these lectures is to touch upon, in some way or the other, one of the themes that are included in the title of the lecture series, Civil Liberties and Academic Freedom. It gives me great pleasure to welcome today Chase Madar, who will be speaking on the topic of Chelsea Manning, national security whistleblowing, and the duties of entailed ignorance. Just by way of background, Chase is a former civil rights attorney and the author of The Passion of Chelsea Manning, the story behind the WikiLeaks whistleblower, which has been published by Verso, and which, if I may so, is a very good read. The book will also be on sale here, Chase, after the talk?
Yes.
All right. He writes, and I've read many of Chase's writings, he writes about foreign affairs and domestic criminal justice for the London Review of Books, Le Monde Diplomatique, the New York Times, The Guardian, The National Interest, The Nation, The American Conservative, Jacobin, Times Literary Supplement, Tom Dispatch, and many other venues. Chase's book is really well written. It's a small book, but it packs quite a punch, and I'm very glad that he's here to tell us about the book. And I think it is essential listening for anyone concerned with the state of American civil liberties in our nation today. All yours, Chase.
Thank you much, Samir, for that lovely introduction. Thanks to the Wolf Institute for the Humanities here at Brooklyn College, and thanks to all of you for coming. Can you hear me in the back all right? I'm a back row kind of person myself, so I care about you especially in the back row. Good. I'm going to be telling you the story of Private Chelsea Manning, who is the source of the biggest national security leak in United States history. I'm going to talk for about half an hour, 40 minutes, and then we can open it up to Q&A, which is when things tend to get truly interesting. I look forward to chatting with you. But I want to start out by throwing a quote at you. That's a very great quote. Maybe you've heard it before. War is God's way of teaching Americans geography. Have you heard this before? War is God's way of teaching Americans geography. It's frequently misattributed to Mark Twain because it's such a good money line, even though he is really not the source of it. And it's often attributed with not a very solid foundation to Ambrose Bierce, another great American writer and great rival of Twain's of that era. War is God's way of teaching geography to Americans. Now, what that means, as you can probably tell, is that the rest of the world outside of the United States is very rarely on the mind of most Americans. Okay, here in Brooklyn College, a lot of people here, a lot of us are foreign-born or first-generation immigrant. It's a little different. But in much of the United States, what goes on outside of the United States is very abstract. It's hard to grasp. It's not very solid until there's some deployment to go to send the Marines to Haiti or the Dominican Republic or to Vietnam or Laos or Afghanistan or Iraq. And this has become all the more true in the past generation and a half. War has become even more abstract and perhaps less of an effective pedagogical tool for geography since the draft was done away with by President Richard Nixon in 1973. Now that there's an all-volunteer army, war is even more abstract to huge bulk of the United States population whose children, brothers, sisters, parents are not the ones getting drafted. It's even more abstract with the advent of drone warfare, where we can militarily intervene. That's the nice polysyllabic way to say wage war in many countries without significant or even any troop commitment, with any boots on the ground. So you may know that we are waging war in some way in 6 countries right now. The Washington Post pointed this out, that over Labor Day weekend, the U.S. had bombed 6 countries. I wonder if we can try to name them quickly before I plunge into the Chelsea Manning lecture. There's Afghanistan, first of all, the longest war in U.S. history. Anyone want to shout out another war that we're in the middle of?
Yemen.
Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, Libya. Okay, and the Obama administration just announced last week that it was expanding its war, especially its drone war in Somalia, another expanded executive power that will be bequeathed to the next president. People who come back from waging war bring back knowledge of that war, and that knowledge is often a burden. And there have been about 2.5 million Americans who have been deployed to Iraq and or Afghanistan, and who have brought back special, intimate, firsthand knowledge of these wars. One of these veterans is named Chelsea Manning. Chelsea Manning was born Bradley Manning in 1987 in Oklahoma City. A precocious child, very handy with computers, kind of sensitive, very interested in politics and the world around from a young age. This is someone who is not blessed with wonderful parents. I'm a little reluctant to criticize other people's parents since I'm a new parent myself, but most of the reporting has accurately, I think, categorized Chelsea Manning's parents as not awesome. Father, a domestic tyrant, an alcoholic. Mother, not super functional, also an alcoholic. And young Manning ends up doing a lot of the child rearing himself at that age, raising himself. His parents divorce, and he graduates from high school at the very young age of 17. And he would like to study either physics or computer science at the university, but in-state tuition in Oklahoma, as in many other states, has become prohibitively expensive. And young Manning's father, the breadwinner, makes a decent money but doesn't feel any particular responsibility to contribute to his child's university education. So young Manning works a lot of jobs, delivering pizza, doing this, doing that, winds up living out of his pickup truck parked in the O'Hare Airport in Chicago. And by 2007, young Manning does what a lot of people do, young people who are at loose ends, who don't have a wonderful family situation that they can count on for support, young people who are interested in seeing the world, would like to go to college. Young Manning enlists in the U.S. Army. And this is at a very low point in recruitment because the Iraq War, which has been going on for 4 years, is at this point undeniably a mess and a disaster. And whatever tenuous peace was holding in Iraq at the beginning of the invasion has unraveled in their sectarian warfare. But Private Manning enlists, not typical Army material. Private Manning is gay and out gay. 5'2", and not the kind of 5'2" person who will take your head off if you mess with them. And Private Manning has a very tough time in basic training, but survives just barely. And because the military is so desperate for people with Private Manning's specific skill set, namely IT and computers and analytic thinking, Private Manning gets ushered through a host of training programs in military intelligence and bases around the country. And in late 2009 is deployed to Forward Operating Base Hammer as part of the U.S. military's surge in Iraq. And this is a base in the middle of nowhere, in the Madain-Kada desert in between Baghdad and the Iran border. It's put in the middle of nowhere because there's a conscious effort to minimize the mental boot print of an occupying army on Iraqi hearts and minds. And it's here in the midst of Operation Iraqi Freedom where Private Manning starts questioning the faith that he had had in the commitment to Iraqi freedom and the mission that was advertised. It's also there that Private Manning gets a security clearance. And this may sound like a big honor or some very special privilege, but in fact there are more than a few people who have security clearance of some kind in the United States. Anyone want to take a guess of how many people have some kind of U.S. government security clearance? Throw out a number.
1.4 million.
Even higher. Double. 4 million people have some kind of security clearance. 1.4 million, I heard that very educated number, thank you. That's the number of people who have a top secret security clearance of some kind. So we might wonder, pause to wonder, how top secret is something if 1.4 million people have a top secret security clearance? That's more than the population of metro area Washington, D.C. That's both Dakotas and Wyoming thrown in. But that's how classification works. And doing military analysis for military intelligence, you find less than rigorous security procedures at Forward Operating Base Hammer in the middle of the Madain-Kada desert. For instance, writable disk drives attached to all the computers. That's usually a no-no if you're handling secret things or purportedly secret things. Because, of course, if there's a writable disk drive attached to the mainframe, then it's easy to copy things, write things, and leave them. People are leaving their security codes on Post-it notes stuck on the telephones. It's important to know this because the image of state security and state secrecy that we often have is from the movies. And you might think that to do the biggest security leak in U.S. history would require suction cups on the walls and ceiling, kind of like Mission Impossible 3. In fact, it's shocking just how easy most of the big security breaches in U.S. history have been. And Chelsea Manning takes note of this and starts to question the real commitment of this mission to Iraqi freedom. Here's one anecdote in Chelsea Manning's own words that are taken from a series of chat logs, conversations, right before she left the U.S. military. This is Manning. I think the thing that got me the most, that made me rethink the world more than anything, was watching 15 detainees taken by the Iraqi Federal Police for printing, quote, anti-Iraq literature. The Iraqi Federal Police wouldn't cooperate with U.S. forces, so I was instructed to investigate the matter, find out who the, quote, bad guys were, and how significant this was for the FPs. It turned out they had printed a scholarly critique against Prime Minister Maliki. I had an interpreter read it for me. And when I found out that it was a benign political critique titled, quote, Where Did the Money Go?, and followed the corruption trail within the PM's cabinet, I immediately took that information and ran to the officer to explain what was going on. He didn't want to hear any of it. He told me to shut up and explain how we could assist the FPs, that's the Iraqi Federal Police, in finding, quote, more detainees. Everything started slipping after that. I saw things differently. I had always questioned the way things worked and investigated to find the truth, but that was a point where I was a part of something. I was actively involved in something that I was completely against. Manning, in this world of the forward operating bases, secure information center, is also exposed to a lot of kill videos that are broadcast on screens as sort of ambient distraction, entertainment. I'm going to play the highlights of one of them for you. That's footage from, as you could probably tell, the gun sight of a U.S. Apache helicopter about a half a mile to 1 mile aerial from July 2007. That video, both the short form, that's just an excerpt, and the longer form, are the most sensational of the WikiLeaks. And what was described as an RPG as a rocket launcher in that video turned out to be a camera telescoping lens. That was a Reuters freelancer. There were about a dozen civilians killed there. There had been some shooting in that vicinity of New Baghdad, a neighborhood of Baghdad, earlier that day. And that's what the U.S. military took as their license to open fire. It's with exposure to that kind of wartime atrocity and others like it that Private Manning decides to do something, decides to leak a great many Army field reports from Afghanistan and from Iraq, and then a great many, in fact 250,000 diplomatic cables from the State Department to WikiLeaks, a relatively new organization at that time in 2010. And this is the largest leak in U.S. history. About 90,000 field logs from the ongoing Afghan war, 392,000 field logs from the Iraq war, files on our Guantanamo prisoners, and again about 250,000 diplomatic cables from the State Department. This leak was very easy to do. Chelsea Manning just wrote down Lady Gaga on a blank CD-ROM and copied a lot of them, and then took the CD back home while on leave, and from the public computers at a Barnes & Noble in greater Washington, D.C., transmitted them to WikiLeaks. Again, this was not especially high-tech, this leak. Now, one thing that's significant about these leaks is that even though it's a huge quantity, not one of the files is classified as top secret. Manning, like 1.4 million other Americans, did have access to many top secret files, but decided not to leak any of them. What's inside of them is still very important, and I think very rich with information and importance. The logs from both the Iraq and the Afghan wars include reports of night raids gone wrong, Afghan outposts laboriously built and then staffed and then abandoned, civilian casualty estimates whose existence had been officially denied. And I think one very important feature is documentation of torture by Iraqi authorities, and the fact that it was official U.S. policy, Fragmentary Order 242, to allow torture to continue to take place as conducted by Iraqi authorities. Even the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S., the top soldier in the U.S., had insisted publicly to the media that every soldier in Iraq had the duty to stop torture, but we know from these leaks that official policy from Donald Rumsfeld's Pentagon was to permit torture and not to stand in the way of it. The diplomatic cables show a different kind of activity, not all of it related to Iraq and Afghanistan. They show, for instance, Washington lobbying to keep the minimum wage down in Haiti, the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, to impose U.S.-style patent law regimes abroad, particularly in Western Europe, for the benefit of big pharmaceutical companies, and also to suppress criminal investigations in Germany into the CIA kidnapping of a terror suspect who turned out to be a case of mistaken identity that didn't prevent him from being rendered to Syria, where he was tortured before being returned to Germany. These are released slowly through the media, through the mainstream media, The Guardian, The New York Times, The Daily Telegraph, The Washington Post. And the reaction that they draw in the U.S. is very telling. It's a reaction of panic for the most part, predictably from Washington officials. For instance, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton calls Manning's leaks, quote, an attack on the international community that, quote, puts people's lives in danger and threatens our national security. Admiral Mike Mullen, then the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, offers that WikiLeaks, quote, might already have on their hands the blood of some young soldier or that of an Afghan family. This is after Admiral Mullen had endorsed President Obama's escalation of Obama's Afghan war. Escalating the war seems to be okay, but some abstract concern for families that might potentially be harmed is another matter. This is very much what we would expect, a ballistic initial response to this breach of secrecy that slowly gets dialed back, and over the course of Manning's court-martial, because Manning was caught, turns into a kind of double subjunctive removed from reality concern. Instead of this has definitely cost American lives or foreign lives, there's a concern that these may have potentially put lives at risk. And in the course of Private Manning's very long court-martial, it went on for over a year, no concrete evidence of anyone, any American soldier or any Afghan or Iraqi civilian, can really be produced to show that concrete harm was done. The reaction of American media and intellectuals to these leaks is very equivocal. On the one hand, you have US news sources very happily making hay out of these stories and running, hundreds and hundreds of stories based on these leaks. On the other hand, the source is not treated with any kind of gratitude for this, but rather with great suspicion and a lot of tongue clicking. Just one example of this, and from the quality media, is on Brian Lehrer's show. Does anyone listen to Brian Lehrer sometimes? I do.
10 o'clock in the morning during the week, WNYC.
Thank you. I mean, it's often a good show. I was very...
A liberal, I assume.
Yeah. I was very happy to do that show myself. But when it came out that one of the State Department cables was a list of 10 strategic spots in the world of vital strategic interest, Brian Lehrer's guest was a New Yorker staffer named George Packer, and they were just clucking like wet hens about the horrible breach of secrecy now that people know that the Gibraltar Strait is a vital strategic zone. You know what? So is the Persian Gulf. And did you know that there are minerals in the Republic of Congo? This is the kind of top secret information that was on this classified list. My guess it was done by some reasonably capable summer intern in the State Department. But instead of treating this as ridiculous that it was ever classified at all, you had even quite intelligent liberal media people expressing their disapproval that such vital secrets were out now, and God knows we're so exposed because people know the Strait of Gibraltar is a vital shipping lane now. You also had a rather panicked response, the worry being that the result of these leaks would be a slippery slope towards total transparency, that the result of Manning's leaks would be an unprecedented degree of everybody knowing everything, the government not being able to keep any secrets, and government would be paralyzed and come to a standstill. Lost in this somewhat extreme response, and I think a bit knee-jerk, is the fact that although Manning's leaks were the biggest in US history, they're still well under 1% of what Washington classifies in any given year. Moreover, the degree of classification has barely gone down since Manning's leaks came out. There's still extreme levels of overclassification in the US government, glacial pace of declassification to the point where some documents are declassified literally centuries after they were first classified or first published or written. And I point specifically to, in 2010, there was a document, a code manual from the James Madison administration that was only declassified then in 2010. So again, that's a kind of geological tempo for declassification, and that's still kind of the norm. that did not change. We have not had total transparency or anything like it. Much as I love slippery slope arguments, I don't find this one to be very convincing. Also lost in the response to Manning's leaks is the cost of secrecy, the cost of extreme dystopian state secrecy. It's a very bitter irony that the Iraq War, which was started to a large degree because of official secrets, lies, and distortion, has a nasty little epilogue where the one soldier who gets punished especially harshly is someone who tried to bring the truth about the Iraq War to people. And this is not to say that greater transparency about the Iraq War and the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam Hussein turned out not to have would have stopped the war or derailed it. But we do know that some senators who did have access to the top secret national intelligence estimate compiled by CIA on whether or not these weapons of mass destruction existed and what a threat they would be if they were, decided to change their vote to a no vote against the war after they fully looked over this evidence, which was kept top secret and out of view. Particularly Senator Bob Graham, a Democrat of Florida, who had first been a supporter of the Iraq invasion, but it was after he took the time, and many senators did not take the time to do this, but after studying the top secret information, that he changed his mind. And we can speculate only how things might have worked out a little differently, a little bit better, had this information been public, had journalists, had other public leaders, students, everyday people had access to this information. So what happened to Chelsea Manning? Private Manning was about to be discharged from the military in mid-2010, but was caught at the very last minute. And Private Manning was caught because then Private Bradley Manning had a very confessional conversation online with a renowned computer hacker named Adrian Lamo. And you can read this long dialogue, these chat logs. They read like a tragic, thoroughly postmodern one-act play. They go on over a few days where Private Manning talks about all these leaks, the motive for doing it, the desire for people to know the truth, the need for people to know what U.S. foreign policy is actually doing, and the reality of war that is not being adequately covered by the U.S. media, and that very few Americans in our all-volunteer Army world have any direct stake in. But Adrian Lamo turns out to be someone working for the feds and a federal informant who turns Private Manning in, and Manning is arrested quickly, spends 2 months in punitive isolation in Kuwait, and then 9 more months at Quantico, the Marine Corps base in Virginia. Placed on suicide watch, stripped naked, not allowed clothing, just a plastic apron, no books, no glasses, and forced to respond every 5 minutes to the guard's question, "Are you okay?" which seems like a particularly insidious form of maltreatment, if not torture. This is against the specific medical advice of Quantico Prison's own doctor, but the doctor's expert medical advice is overruled because the prison officials and the military want to make a big punitive show of coming down like a ton of bricks on the private who dared make a fool out of the U.S. military. This goes on for 11 months, and eventually Manning is deemed not a suicide risk when there's growing international outcry, not much outcry within the United States, and Manning joins the medium security military prison population. Manning is court-martialed, and in 2013, after a long trial, is convicted of 11 charges, the most serious of which is violating the Espionage Act of 1917, a piece of legislation which was never intended to punish domestic whistleblowers and leakers, but was first retooled for that purpose by Richard Nixon against Daniel Ellsberg. And it's a piece of legislation that President Obama has been particularly aggressive in using against leakers and whistleblowers within the national security world. Manning's sentence, 35 years. And the day after the sentence, she announces that she wishes to be known as Chelsea Manning, that she's transgender, and her story is far from over now. As a soldier, she has been pushing fiercely and effectively with the help of her lawyer, also named Chase Strangio of the ACLU, to fight for transgender prisoners' rights within the military system. This is something that affects relatively few people immediately because the US military prison population doesn't have that many transgender individuals within it. But it's very important because the US military is an institution that is one of the leaders in the United States, and what it does, whether it's in integration or in medical care, is often frequently adopted by other institutions, other parts of government, other parts of the private sector later on. So Chelsea Manning is continuing to fight. Because there's a law and philosophy class that's in here, I want to go down one rabbit hole briefly about the significance of these leaks and what they mean and what they don't mean. It is frequently said in a colloquial way that Manning released news and evidence of war crimes and exposed war crimes. And if you look at that horrible video, which I played for you without any warning, that seems like an utterly uncontroversial statement. That's an atrocity that you witness civilians getting gunned down by a bantering gunship crew half a mile above them. The people on the ground probably weren't even aware of the helicopter being up there. Then, of course, that must be a war crime. And of course, these other things must be war crimes. Checkpoint shootings in Iraq, night raids gone wrong in Afghanistan. But there's a strange and somewhat sinister silence from most of the leading human rights organizations after these leaks come out, especially that video. And you would think that Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International or Human Rights First would be loudly condemning what is captured very clearly on screen as a violation of human rights. In fact, there's no response from any of the big three of American and international human rights organizations. Why is that? It turns out that the laws of war are incredibly permissive and much more about licensing the use of lethal force and then serving as an immunity shield to soldiers than they are about protecting civilians. You can hear the helicopter crew check in with their central command and with targeting lawyers there to get approval. What they were doing is in fact lawful. And I say that, and I want to be very clear, not to defend the action, because I think it's atrocious, but just so that we all see that the laws of war permit that rather than prohibit it. That the laws of war, their real purpose in war, despite a lot of folklore, is to lubricate the use of violence, less than to restrain it. This is maybe a subtle point, but I think it's an important one. The importance of the laws of war is inflated routinely by two opposing sides, both by right-wing nationalists and by liberal legalists, who both like to believe, for utterly different reasons, that the laws of war are a potent, powerful tool for limiting violence. Right-wing nationalists like to believe this because they typically need a scapegoat and something to blame for strategic catastrophe. You may have heard before that in Vietnam, the United States lost because we were fighting with one hand tied behind our backs, or both hands, or that we weren't allowed to win there. And that's usually said with a great bitterness. And what's meant by this is that the U.S. totally could have won if there weren't for overly restrictive rules of engagement. That's the term of art for the laws of war on the battlefield. And of course, this is just a kind of scapegoating. When there's a strategic blunder of the magnitude of invading South Vietnam or invading Iraq, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for policy elites to admit that they have made a catastrophic error. And for the people, often for the people who have fought in those wars. So you need to blame someone. You blame the laws of war, the lawyers whose perfidious, slightly cowardly respect for the enemy allowed them to get away with so much. And, we can't play by the Marquis of Queensberry rules if we're going to fight, that kind of talk. Liberals, on the other hand, very much like to believe that the laws of war are a potent, effective way to restrain violence because this holds forth the promise of clean, hygienic, humanitarian warfare. It holds forth the promise of humanitarian intervention without tears that can be used effectively to stop genocide, to stop other wars, that you can have effective counterinsurgency campaigns that are basically like Peace Corps projects, except if all the Peace Corps volunteers are soldiers with automatic weaponry. If people just use the laws of war, then they will win over the population and then win over the hearts and minds. That turns out also to be based in very little evidence, in a lot of myth-making, and a lot of denial of the historical experience of counterinsurgency of U.S. soldiers in Southeast Asia, French soldiers in Algeria, and again, the U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan. But for those two utterly different sets of reasons, the laws of war are promoted as this very effective check on violence, where, as one retired Air Force Major General told me at a workshop last year, very often the laws of war and the lawyers involved in war are there to spur on reluctant soldiers to pull the trigger. It's very difficult to get psychologically healthy, normal, for lack of a better word, young people to kill other people, most of the time anyway. And you need lawyers to say, no, this is a good kill, go do it, pull the trigger, drop the bomb. And you see some of that in that horrible video that I showed you before. So that's something for the law and philosophy people here. I want to recap a little bit about Chelsea Manning, whose only hope now, I think, is some kind of last-minute commutation or pardon, the two kinds of federal clemency. A pardon would expunge Private Manning's entire record. That's been done before to soldiers who violate some law of war. Richard Nixon was only too happy to grant a pardon to someone named Lieutenant William Calley. Some of the older people may know who he was. Lieutenant William Calley led the My Lai massacre in our Vietnam War that killed 300 Vietnamese civilians. And his transgression became a cause célèbre in the United States. He was championed by pop music singers, not just in the South, but even in northern states like New Jersey. State legislatures passed bills defending him, calling for his release. And even in Georgia, where he was interned in the brig, in the stockade, a young governor of Georgia named Jimmy Carter championed Lieutenant William Calley's release. But there hasn't been such a groundswell of support for Chelsea Manning. It's as if bringing back all this direct news of war, these very raw field reports, this video footage. And by the way, that video was not even classified. Some journalists had made requests for it because they had heard about it. The military fobbed them off, just didn't feel like releasing it, even though it was not classified in any way. But there's something about Chelsea Manning's leaks that's unforgivable because it takes away our innocence. It's sharing the burden of knowledge of war with us. It's much harder to look away. And that, it seems, is much less pardonable than leading the massacre of a few hundred civilians. I don't know how hard convincing, you need that Chelsea Manning deserves at the very least a commutation. One objection that's frequently raised is that, well, if Chelsea Manning gets a commutation, then soldiers will just do whatever they want, and you need order and discipline in any command structure. That's entirely true, that you can't have a military without military discipline. It's a mistake, however, to think that granting one commutation, or even a few of them, will somehow tear the whole house of cards down. We've seen very clearly that military discipline is not as fragile as all that. We've seen this because we know, for instance, in the Haditha massacre, where a Marine troop killed 24 Iraqi civilians in 2005, many of them killed execution style. There were no serious charges brought in the end. The leader was knocked down a degree in his military rank and lost a little pay, but that's it. There was no real punishment. We've seen that there's a serious problem of rape and sexual assault in the U.S. military that rarely goes punished. And that, too, has not resulted in the disintegration of military discipline in general. So I think we know very clearly that a commutation granted for Manning, who has now been in prison for 6 years, would not result in all of military discipline evaporating instantly. Chelsea Manning is an extraordinary person, in many ways just one of many Americans in many different categories. One of 2.5 million veterans of the Iraq and or Afghan wars. One of 1.4 million people, mostly American, with security clearance. And now one of about 2.2 million incarcerated people in the United States. She's been victimized by prison authorities in ways that are very common in the United States. Minor disciplinary transgressions can result in a week in solitary. I wish I could say that that's some horrible aberration in the American criminal justice system, but we have between 70 and 100,000 people in long-term solitary in the United States already. And instead of being used as a tool of last resort, it is often used as a tool of the very first punishment to be inflicted on people for minor transgressions from coast to coast. And so in that way, Chelsea Manning is quite ordinary. She's continuing to fight for transgender equality and justice, and you can read her writings in her own words. She's writing frequently, posting on Medium and writing for The Guardian occasionally. I recommend checking it out. I'd like to open things for question and answer now.
Questions? Yeah.
Philosophically and morally, I can understand your viewpoint. However, on 3 points, I think I disagree. First of all, I believe that one of the reasons why there is not such a backlash over what Chelsea Manning did as compared to, let's say, Ali, is because of what happened on September 11th, 2001. People in the United States and all over the world have taken a different viewpoint of feeling personally aggrandized by what happened on that day. Second point where I somewhat disagree with you. As a judge advocate officer, I have been told on many occasions by my superiors as well that if a soldier is committed what is a patently egregious crime, that person is to be reported in court-martial. Whether this happens or not, that, of course, is within the culture of the system itself, which I can understand. And the third point I'd like to make is that it is not exactly true that sexual abuse and other, what you might call harassment or maybe criminal behavior is being overlooked within the military. That is not the case, because more and more they're coming down on them. and even transgenders in the military are being accommodated today much more than in the civilian society. So on those points, I tend to disagree. Morally and philosophically, yes, we can all agree. But when you're talking about a soldier who's out in the field and he's confronted or she's confronted by an enemy, very often they will feel targeted one way or another, or feel that they have to get rid of them. It's a question not so much of the culture or so on, it's a question of the perspective. And very often what somebody who has not been in that position might look upon very askance, but on the other hand, when you're out there and you're in the front line, you see things a little different because your body is on the line too.
Let me respond quickly to all three of those point by point. First, your first point about 9/11 and the carnage in the United States being a good explanation for why there's not a whole lot of sympathy for Manning is quite accurate, that explains it. I don't think that's a good explanation. I think it's an accurate explanation, but I think people need to get beyond that. And I think even looking at American security from just a very cold, realpolitik, reptile perspective, the amount of blood and money that has been destroyed and used up due to the Iraq and Afghan wars is orders of magnitude higher than the carnage from the 9/11 attacks. And if you measure security in blood, money, and risk, then you need to look at what are the things that led to our catastrophic decision to invade Iraq and to prolong a flailing counterinsurgency campaign in Afghanistan. And government secrecy is a huge part of what made those happen. It's a but-for cause. Okay, and we're heading into that too. Your second point, what was it again? It was
Not the fact that we're actually not supposed to tolerate criminal conduct.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's true, but the idea that legal systems make mistakes, that's sometimes cast as some kind of decadent, recent idea, that in olden days the law was the law and people respected. Of course, that's nonsense. The struggle against the law and legalism is as old as the law. Whether you read Sophocles and Antigone's clash with the state in Antigone, if you read the Pauline letters in the New Testament, there's a fierce strain of anti-legalism there. A frustration and a discontent with legalism as being an ironclad system that is always right is as old as civilization. And that's not some decadent new innovation. And I think it's good to recognize when the law makes mistakes and to recognize that the law is always a work in progress. Its change is often so slow as not to be visible. But we all depend on the law changing because many of the laws that we have now are intolerable. If we look at U.S. history, most of the ugliest chapters of American history have to do with things that were sanctified and even rigorously enforced by the power of law. And I don't mean to single out the military as being egregiously bad in this field because, I agree with you. The military is often at the vanguard of a lot of real social progress in the U.S. But I think here it's important to see the military, however, is not infallible either, and that a commutation would not derail anything there. So I'm insisting on that. Next question.
I think one of the things that the Manning case does, and I think the phenomenal case that does in general, is raise the question of how much should the populace know about what the government does. Because one of the arguments made in response to the Chelsea Manning disclosure, and even has been made in response to the Assange WikiLeaks many times, is that these kinds of leaks actually make it impossible for the government to do the kinds of things that it does. And in fact, this transparency is mistaken, that this very demand for transparency is mistaken. And so the question of where the line is drawn on how much we should know at any given time. So would you say something too about what Chelsea Manning tells us about how much we should know about what the government does? I mean, given things like political philosophies that talk about the need to push back against things like opaque power.
Well, I want to go back to one point. The reaction, even in the quality media, to Chelsea Manning's leaks has been that this puts us on the brink of total transparency that will paralyze government and make modern governance impossible. Well, clearly that has not happened. And clearly the WikiLeaks files did not prevent the expansion of the Somalia war. It did not prevent the Libya war that we waged. We've launched over 12,000 bombing sorties over ISIS-held areas in Syria. It would be mistaken to say that WikiLeaks, for better or for worse, I think for worse, has had a huge impact on American statecraft. And this is kind of disturbing. You might hope that this release of knowledge, especially after wars that have not gone well at all, would change things. But we've learned that knowledge isn't the magic catalyst that professional knowledge workers, whether you're a journalist, academic, activist, what have you, lawyer frequently, would like to believe it is. And even though knowledge is a frequent MacGuffin in suspense movies, the goal that people are fighting to get and then release to the world, usually at the end, that's the happy ending, to keep a piece of knowledge from being released or to get that piece of knowledge. You see this in all the Bourne movies. Well, that's not real life. That really the impact of knowledge on how statecraft is conducted, how people lead their lives, is much smaller. Now, it's not totally impotent. I don't want to go all the way in that direction. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, sometimes people truly do base their decisions on the information they have. That actually does happen, whether it's buying a used car or deciding to invade or not to invade a sovereign nation. But very often, knowledge is powerless. I think it's important that intellectuals understand ignorance. Intellectuals very badly need to understand ignorance, and I think we've all had a master class in that in the past month. And we will continue to be taught new lessons in that, and the power of ignorance and the limits of knowledge and the limits of facts. And this isn't, I want to make clear, not to dismiss it entirely as just totally useless, but clearly something more than knowledge is needed. And it's not just the WikiLeaks releases, they're entering the capillary system of journalism, of scholarship, and it's important that we know these things. Knowledge is not a bad thing. Knowing what your government is doing is not a bad thing. But unless there's political organization and political muscle to use it, it doesn't have any magic political agency all by itself.
Very few instances of actionable intelligence having any outcome on the greatest military battles that we've been exposed to. So
yeah, I think that's very important. Even in wartime, the role of intelligence services is much smaller than people think. And that's from a very orthodox military historian, John Keegan. The role of intelligence in peacetime is even tinier, despite the huge budgets allocated to NSA and other intelligence agencies. And it's very hard to get beyond certain, ideas and disproportions that we've learned from watching, James Bond movies, reading John le Carré novels, as much as I love them all. But I think the Soviet Union had a wonderfully capable intelligence service. In the end, I don't think it had anything to do with the ultimate outcome of that, the survival of the USSR and the American victory in the Cold War.
What would you say to somebody who is trying to understand the balance of what the public needs to know and quote unquote their security? Like the individual that says, well, I would rather not know about what doing because what the government, everything the government is doing because I feel that they're going to make sure that I'm safe. Mm-hmm. I'm just curious of like a...
I would say this. In the cost-benefit analysis of security versus transparency, first, it is assumed falsely that it is security versus transparency. It's really the cost-benefit between secrecy and transparency, and that the costs of high levels of secrecy have been systematically underestimated. That the costs of extreme government secrecy are much higher than we think. I mean, and to repeat what I told this gentleman, the costs to national security from invading Iraq are immense. I mean, much higher than the 9/11 attacks to the U.S. And I'm looking at it again just from a very narrow reptilian realpolitik perspective. But the U.S. has paid a much higher price in blood, money, and risk from invading Iraq, which happened to a large degree because of government secrecy, distortion, and lies, than from the 9/11 attacks themselves. And this idea that the less we know, the safer we are, I think is demonstrably false just from that. But it's important to realize, to understand the feeling, the sentiment behind that, because for many people, ignorance it's not an empty space. It's not a vacant lot being, that's ready to be built upon by, journalists and media people and professors. It's like a comforting fleece blanket that you wrap around yourselves, and that ignorance keeps us pure and decent and good. And we have very mixed cultural attitudes. They're very deep-seated about knowledge. There's one perennial bestseller in the United States that starts off with a nice young couple getting evicted from their garden apartment because they know the wrong thing. They learn the wrong thing. But at the end of this book, there's a good punchline. I'm an atheist myself, but there's a punchline that the truth will set you free. Well, which is it? Is truth something that sets you free, or is it something that makes you dirty? That is your original sin, is knowing the wrong things. That's something that's very deep-seated in our culture, the way we approach these things. And when you're trying to enlighten people, as a scholar, as a writer, whatever line of work you're in, it's important to have that in mind, because again, ignorance is not always just empty space. Sometimes it's a very dense, solid object.
Yes, to kind of go off what you're saying, the information that we do get from these military acts or whatever is usually kind of sent out through YouTube or other websites, but usually when the media gets a hold of it, because all the information tends to be watered down, not many goes through to the point where they either find a scapegoat for it, and then do the whole blame game, or say like this information not so important, you don't need to worry about that, or to the point where they're like demonizing people that if you know this information, you're going to cause some trouble with someone else. It gets to the point where I feel like the lawmakers tend to ignore the laws that they're trying to enforce. Just like a parent will tell their child not to smoke a cigarette while they're smoking a cigarette. Yeah. In that sense. So. When it comes down to it, like, how can we put our trust in these lawmakers, physically, mentally, philosophically? How can we put the trust in these lawmakers who tend to ignore the laws that they try to enforce themselves, all to make sure that we stay blissfully ignorant to what they're doing.
Okay, two things to that. First of all, I would recommend, instead of putting trust in lawmakers, in taking a very different approach. That I would recommend, rather than finding ways to put trust in them, finding ways to hold feet to fire, finding ways to put pressure on, finding ways even to penalize lawmakers who are either disobeying some laws or failing to change laws. The second thing I want to point out is it's important to see a little bit beyond the law. There's a tendency to have kind of a just law fallacy, to think that the legal system that we have must be just, and if something bad happens, that must be a violation of the law. It's not really that way. I mean, you saw that atrocity from the gun sight scope of an Apache helicopter. That was in accordance with the law. Washington pressuring Haiti to keep its minimum wage down, I find that to be quite abominable, but that's perfectly legal. Many of the worst things around today are perfectly legal. So it's important to realize that for so many things, whether it's the way Wall Street is structured, the financial system works, or the laws governing police use of force, or the laws governing war, very often the problem is the law, not people breaking the law, but people acting in accordance with the law. And that it's not just violations of the law, but the ordinary uses of the law that are the truly awful thing.
Right. But if we do act in accordance with the law, isn't that just enabling, in a way, for them to continue doing what they're doing? I mean, if we end up not following the law, we're viewed as criminals. But if we do follow the law, we're seen as enablers. I mean, where would be, I would say, the median, or in a way to break that median?
Yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, I don't want to paint too lurid a picture of the rule of law. Some laws are perfectly good. Many are, okay?
Right.
I'm not saying laws are by nature horrible. We should just throw all of them out. But, laws are constantly changing because people are constantly applying pressure to them, sometimes through purely legal means, lobbying members of Congress or other officials, sometimes through civil disobedience. Civil disobedience very often means breaking the law in a deliberate way that will get attention, force a change, prevent the system from working in the way it's designed to work. So that's a time-old tradition, and there's a vast literature on it.
To summarize, if I may, in all humility, war is legalized murder. Ignorance is bliss in our society today, where the former campaign manager of Trump said the Times editor should be lynched or go to jail or something in the paper. And we have a problem with transparency with the mayor of the city of New York in terms of his campaign contribution organization. I cite that. And Obama ran in 2008 on transparency. And Hillary, you quote, "You have totally confirmed my cynicism and my feeling that it is basically human nature that is foul."
Thank you. I'm always happy to confirm someone's cynicism, so that gives me satisfaction. But the purpose of my talk here is not to, spread futility and despair, because I think there's meaningful examples set by people like Chelsea Manning or Edward Snowden and many other people in our day-to-day lives.
I'm 80 years old, so these are young people, so I want exclusion. I want you to realize.
Other questions? Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Well, first of all, law is a reflection of society. And last month, as you said, we saw a lot of that, right? Another thing is that it's very nice, pleasant, feel utopian. But it takes changes in the public sentiment, including on the Supreme Court too, or all the judicial and legislative plateaus, in order to bring that about. So, what would you do in order it to put into effect what you would like to see without endangering the public?
Well, first of all, I want to push back on two things in your preamble. When we say law is a reflection of society, look, society is not a single unified one-cell organism. Society is something that's constantly changing, with some parts pushing against the other parts pushing against that. I don't think we have the laws we deserve because the we, well, which we? I mean, most people I know think the criminal laws in this country are horrible. I don't think we deserve that. I know I don't. I know a lot of the people in jail don't deserve them. So to say, well, we're all responsible, this is the, this society we're in, we get the laws we deserve. I think we need to look at the, minorities, the concentrated power blocks that are propping up, our insane war on drugs, war on crime and mass incarceration, or in this field, propping up a dystopian regime of state secrecy and push against these power blocks. I don't think it's just amorphously all of society. Now, what would I change? I also don't think that Manning is remotely utopian. And this is something in the media response that was very common. Well, WikiLeaks and Manning, they're utopian. And well, that's great, but I think I'm a very practical person here. I look at the disaster that's resulted from our dystopian levels of state secrecy. We have dystopian levels of government secrecy, distortion, and lies, and this leads to just utter catastrophes, like the invasion of Iraq, whose aftermath we're still dealing with. I'm a very practical person. I think having a much higher degree of government transparency is anything but utopia. I think it's a very practical step to stop these crazy dystopian hubristic ideas like democratizing the entire Middle East through armed force. So I look at it from a very different end of the telescope there. I see Manning as a very practical person, and I'm here to share some very practical ideas too. We're out of time already. Thank you all so much.
In case anybody's interested in getting copies of